So welcome, everyone. I know there's still people who are getting their lunch. And we have what is a pretty exciting afternoon, at least for those of us who are democracy geeks. As people know, the Shanker Institute does these basically monthly panels on issues of common concern. And rarely am I, by the way, I'm Randy Weingarten, the president of the AFT and the president of the Shanker Institute. But rarely do I get to be in a moderator position. Most of the time, Leo Casey, who is the executive director of Shanker, if he has me on a panel, makes me be a presenter and doing some of the work of presenting. I actually said, no, I want to be a moderator this time because there is a panel that, frankly, I wanted to ask them a lot of questions in this moment. And I will just introduce the panel and then try to contextualize this session and then just launch into questions. And if we have time, we will take questions from the Twitter universe and from the audience as well. This is not Passover, but I do actually have 4 questions for each of the panelists. Maybe it should be, that kind of sense of the Exodus and Passover. But the person to my immediate left is Danielle Allen, who is the James Bryant Conant University professor at Harvard University, and I could not say that 5 times fast.
No one can.
She is the director of Harvard's Edmund Safra Center for Ethics and is the author of Talking to Strangers, Anxieties of Citizenship Since Brown versus Board of Education, and someone that we go to often to talk about civic education and civic engagement and what we need to do in this time to empower people and to be the connective tissue between empowerment and voting. And the person to Danielle's immediate left is Timothy Snyder, who is the, how do I say it, Hussam professor?
It's 11 now anyway, so just
say
11.
Levin, excuse me. It's the Levin Professor of History at Yale University. He's the permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, Austria, and he is the author of a book that I would actually say several of you in this audience have received as a gift from the AFT, because I think we have now actually given out about 3,000 of these. The book On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. And I admit that I give this out to many people for not because I had initially thought that that would help Dr. Snyder be on the bestseller list, but because it was a very effective way of answering questions when people would say, what is going on and what do I do? And I think he gave us a gift to take the knowledge that Dr. Snyder has and find a way to make it accessible to those of us who are regular human beings to understand this moment and to think about what to do about it. And speaking of the moment, let me just say the following couple of things before I launch into questions and thank them profusely for both being here, is that every day, and by the way, for those of you who are Twitter fanatics, the Twitter handle today is Teach Democracy, right? Teach Democracy. So every day if you actually put on some cable news or read some newspaper, you see the question about whether or not Russia influenced our elections. You see the word Mueller, or the two words Mueller investigation. If you turned on the TV yesterday, I don't know if you turned on Fox, but if you turned on the TV yesterday, you would see that a judge in North Carolina struck the lines, the congressional lines of the House of Representatives, representatives in North Carolina because they were overtly political. In fact, one of the people who drew the lines said, guilty as charged. I thought the Republicans, this is my words, not his, but the evidence was, I thought the Republicans would be better, so I wanted to make the lines amenable for the Republicans to win. The 2016 election, 3 million people voted, 3 million people more voted for the person who was not president, 77,000 votes in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin decided that election. 22,000 votes decided the recent Alabama Senate election. In Virginia, there is still legal proceedings over the House, the last House of Delegate seat, which will decide which party controls that chamber and therefore controls a lot of the legislation in Virginia. Voter suppression. University of Wisconsin, Madison study showed that as many as 45,000 people statewide in Wisconsin were deterred from voting by the Wisconsin ID law in 2016. Why do I say all this? Because clearly voting matters. And clearly the policies and practices, the constitutional norms in this country change radically based upon who is in office. And that has probably never been clearer than the last several months. So this may be the social studies teacher in me, but I'm hoping that after so many years of people rolling their eyes when it comes to any conversation about democracy or civic engagement, we've actually arrived at a new stage in the conversation in the United States about what is happening in our democracy, and then the next conversation, which is how do we make civics real in classrooms and in our communities. And frankly, that's why the two people we have with us for the next hour and a half help us make sense of talking through what this moment means. What is happening in this country? How do we navigate it? This is in an hour and a half. How do we teach about it? And frankly, from my perspective, and excuse my bias, which will be the fourth question, how do we build a new sense of civic engagement? And so both Danielle and Tim are leading public intellectuals. They are generally considered, not just by me, to be amongst the best scholars, the very best scholars in their respective fields of history and political science. And I am really honored and grateful that they have given us of their time and their intellect and their passion to be with us today. So, this is my first question. Thank you both for being here. This is my first question. The title of this conversation is Teaching Democratic Citizenship When Democracy is at Risk. So if we start with the second phase, when democracy is at risk, that leads us to, in some ways, we're 1 year out. We're 1 year out from Donald Trump's presidency. We're 1 year out from Republican majorities in Congress. We're 1 year out from what is essentially one-party rule. And so the question is, what's the state of American democracy? And is it deeply at risk? And if so, how deeply at risk is it? And so, Tim, you wrote this book on tyranny after you wrote a Facebook post on this, in which you described the warning signs of the rise of authoritarian rule based upon your studies of the rise of totalitarianism in the 20th century in Europe. So the question, I think, for you is pretty obvious. What's your assessment through the lens of what you know?
Randy, I want to thank you very much for being here. The honor is mine to be in your presence. It's institutions like yours which create the space between the lonely individual and the government, which makes association and democracy possible. It's a great pleasure to be speaking with Professor Allen as well, who has made the very important argument, and I'm just going to brutally paraphrase it here, that if you want to have a society of equal citizens, it's not enough to teach individuals how to make money. It's also important to teach individuals how to be individuals so that when they are adults, they can make political choices, including voting, which might lead to a more equal society. It's a very important argument, which she makes with much ramification. I'm very glad to share this table with her. On this issue of democracy, so I'm not an Americanist, right? I work on Eastern Europe. When I look at the United States, I don't see that this is normal. I don't start from the premise that there was American democracy. For me as a citizen, American democracy is aspirational. I mean, before we got to 2016, there were already significant ways in which the United States was not a democracy. I would say in the 2010s, even before the election, thanks to 2 Supreme Court decisions in 2010, 2013, we were actually moving away and not towards democracy, even before the election. The gerrymandering, you know, when I hear the gerrymandering, I think of 1920s and 1930s, where, you know, little tiny East European dictatorships did exactly the same thing. They drew up electoral districts so that one ethnic group would always win. An ethnic group which maybe had 45% total would dominate the state because of the way the election districts were drawn up. And if you look at that in Yugoslavia in 1930, it looks exotic. But of course, that's my actual life. And so I then look at America and I think, yeah, this is actually, you know, this is not democracy. Democracy here is an aspiration. And I stress this because I want to make sure that, you know, we don't get ourselves into the mindset where we say, there was this lost golden state of American democracy in 2016, and now all of a sudden we've lost it, and, you know, oh, woe is us, what can we do, the big bad Trump and the big bad Trump voters. I think American democracy is an aspiration. I think if we had American democracy, we'd have much better policy outcomes, we'd be much happier, and, you know, GDP would be much bigger, and so on and so forth. So I just want to start from that premise, that there are things that are wrong with the structure. Now, to answer the question, I'll say something about the executive, about the President of the United States. To me, it's clear after a year, and this is what I thought after watching him for a year in the campaign, that this is not an individual who feels comfortable within a rule of law state. This is not an individual who feels comfortable with constraints. And in an interesting way, and there's a good book now just out about this by guys called Levitsky and Zilblad up at Harvard. What he does is by his own behavior, he reveals the norms that we took for granted. Right? He's a kind of explicator. Like, his behavior reveals the things that we thought shouldn't be done, couldn't be done, wouldn't be done. He reveals how it's not just the written laws, but it's the norms that we took for granted which hold the system together. So what are those behaviors? One of them is the admiration for foreign dictators, which is not just a kind of quirk, right? It's revealing. It tells you what kind of system he would like to be in. The fact that he gets along better with an Erdogan or a Duarte or a Putin, right, is revealing of what kind of system that he would like to be in. The fact that he cannot tell the truth is not just a quirk. It's not just something which is funny and no one should be laughing at it. It's revealing of the kind of system that he wants to be in. A system in which leading is about creating a constant sense of spectacle, right? In which de facto there isn't really very much policy. And the language, right? The way that he uses the language is extremely revealing. So Also, the one data point we didn't have so much a year ago, which is clearer now, is how he talks about U.S. history. So he stresses that the slogan of the whole administration is America First, right? America First turns up over and over and over again to the point where it's banal. And the thing about America First is that America First is a hankering back to an alternative 1930s in which A, we didn't build a welfare state, and B, we didn't go to war against the Germans. That's what America First means, right? And by the way, the America Firsters were very often also nativists and racists in an American context as well, right? So America First doesn't mean putting America first. Like anybody who's in any, America First means we're actually losing in all of our trade negotiations, if you care about trade negotiations, because the strategy of negotiating where you just whine a lot and then you get to the foreign country's capital and you flatter them is not actually a good negotiation strategy, right? So we're getting killed in actual negotiation, just by the way. But what it means domestically is hearkening back to the 1930s. The data point we had less of was the hearkening back to the 1860s. I find it interesting that Mr. Trump and Mr. Kelly refer to the 1860s as a war which could have been avoided, right? That's revealing about the kind of country they think they want to be in or they think is possible. A country where we didn't need to fight a civil war, where reasonable people could have made a deal, right, at that time, where slavery could have reasonably continued for decades afterwards, right? That's another very revealing data point, which I think we didn't have before. So this is about warning signs. The other half of the question is, the important half of the question is what we do about it. We don't all have to recognize every single warning sign. I think it's important for each of us to recognize the warning signs that we understand and the ones that we know how to do something about. And just pick something and do something about that. And some American groups have been pretty good. Lawyers, a lot of lawyers, not all of them, right? But a lot of lawyers have done surprisingly well, which is an example I'm fixated on because the lawyers completely went the wrong way in National Socialism in Germany in the 1930s, and that was extremely important to how things turned out. People marching have made a big difference. Little civil society groups have made a big difference. So it hasn't been great, but I would give us a B minus. I mean, that's not a Yale B, and Yale would be an A, right? But I wish that were a joke. But I'd give us a B minus, right? So just to sum up, it's very important for us not to say like, we had this democracy and now, it's under threat. It's very important to say we started from an imperfect starting point. Trump is helping us to see a lot of the problems that were incipient in the system. And now, if you're going to be a citizen, you kind of have to pick one of those things and then just keep at it all the time.
Thank you. And Danielle, I'm going to ask you the same questions. I should actually say either Professor Allen and Professor Snyder, but for this conversation, if they don't mind, and I hope you don't mind, I want your indulgence of saying Tim and Danielle, if that's okay. Someone just laughed. But it's basically...
I vote for that.
Thank you. I basically, so, as Tim said, Tim talked about Danielle's writings. If you read Danielle's columns in the Washington Post, if you are a teacher of civics, Danielle is required reading. What she did in terms of talking about Brown and looking through the lens of equity is required reading for any of us that actually teach K-12 in the United States. But so you too have actually looked at the underlying political developments, and you've actually looked at it, Tim has looked at it through the lens of what happened in Europe. You've looked at it through the lens of equity and through what has happened racially in the United States and elsewhere. So what do you think is this moment, and what are the kind of critical developments that you often talk about in those terms?
Thank you, Randy. And like Tim, I'd just like to thank you for the chance of this conversation to be here with you and with all of your colleagues in this space. It's an important conversation. So I am going to answer your question about race and equity, but I want to lay the table for that and say some things that may go against the grain a little bit. So I think we should spend a little less time thinking about Trump, in all honesty, and that we should spend more time thinking about the American people, who we are, what we need to be. And to underscore what I mean, let me say this. I want us to think about our institutions for a second. All the big buildings in Washington, the Capitol, the Supreme Court, the White House, et cetera, all the Capitol buildings in states and so forth. Those things constitute an asset, a huge body of property in many ways owned by all of us. We all have an ownership stake in them. But it's worth thinking more about what those institutions are, because the other thing that they are actually is a concretized, concrete form of knowledge, all right? So you had all these people in the 1700s and then over the course of the 1800s who tried to think about this question of how ordinary people, not aristocrats, men, yes, but nonetheless, the conception of ordinary people can do collective decision-making together. And they had some people, in Massachusetts who spent a lot of time practicing in town hall meetings, and they had people in other places practicing in other kinds of forms, and they learned stuff. They had actual knowledge about how to build institutions in order to check power and in order to distribute power in some kind of egalitarian way, egalitarian in contrast to what they knew from Europe. And they didn't write philosophical treatises. Okay, like Federalist Papers is great and exciting, but it's not a philosophical treatise. They didn't actually take the time to write an encyclopedia of everything they'd figured out. They just built institutions. Those institutions, again, are these deposits of knowledge. Now, the problem with storing knowledge that way is people lose sight of the fact that that's what those institutions are, actual treasuries of insight, wisdom, discovery. And I would say that this democracy has been at risk for decades because we, the people, have lost the knowledge that went into building those things. And consequently, we barely know how to operate them. All right? And I'd been kind of having this sneaking suspicion for some time, to be honest, like all of you. You've been working on civic education for a long time here. It's not like we just started a year ago, right? And I'd kind of been noticing things like the fact that we've been investing so much in STEM education is important and meaningful, but has anybody noticed that the more a student is focusing on STEM, the less likely they are to participate? So our investments in STEM have been simultaneously eroding our democratic capacities. I've been noticing, I had these concerns about the knowledge that had been passed down through generations in the form of our institutions and whether we still had it. And then we had the election, and I had, in all honesty, my worry had been focused on young people. Were they getting enough time on civics? Were they getting enough time not just to learn about the structure of institutions, but to understand the nature of agency, of personal empowerment, the skills, personal skills of speech, of interaction with other people, of imagination, of courage necessary to operate these institutions? Were they learning these things? I've been worried about the young people. And then after the election, I got so many calls and inquiries from people who wanted to know what to do. More or less people my age and somewhat older. And they didn't know what to do. And that really blew me away. That I literally had to sit down with people and say, okay, here's how you run a meeting. Here's how you chair a meeting. Here's how you start brainstorming what the problems in your community are, in your city, in your state, and then get to the country. And here's how you prioritize. And once you've figured out what the things you care most about, here's how you find your menu of policy possibilities. And here's how you start evaluating which ones are the best ones. And here's how you find allies. Find allies to help you advance that cause. All right, now to me, this stuff is really basic. And I think it's probably basic around here, anybody who's been part of an organizing tradition. But that knowledge is almost gone, as best as I can tell, through most of our society. So really, my goodness, we just have such a big job to do recovering bodies of knowledge that once upon a time were deeply embedded in our culture. Now, how does this relate to issues of race and equity? I think we have a challenge that's specific to our own generation here. But it's still a knowledge and a skills challenge. This country has been plagued by racial injustice from the beginning. And we sit at a moment where very soon, no particular ethnic group will be in the majority in this country. And we've never known how to operate political systems where that's true. We've operated political systems for centuries based on the conception that somebody was in the majority and somebody was in the minority. And it's worked all the way through our concepts, the conceptual structures of our judicial system, everywhere. So the fact of the matter is, as we work towards building an equitable society, a multicultural society, we don't just have to recover bodies of knowledge that we've lost, we simultaneously need to innovate. All right, discover the solution to developing egalitarian institutions in multicultural context. So my metaphor for all of this is always that we have to rebuild the ship while we're trying to sail it. Okay, we have to learn how to sail the ship again and rebuild it at the same time. That's basically the challenge, I would say, that we currently face.
Wow. And that actually, it actually was going to bring me to the next question about populism, and what that term, how we understand that. But in both of your answers, I want to ask like 500 follow-up questions. But, it is, when you think about what Danielle said, Tim, about, how you innovate and build and try to have some kind of egalitarian democracy, which is frankly probably more aspirational than democracy, and something that I would probably argue that no country has ever done, and that no democracy has ever done. But coming up against that is that in our democratic culture, the whole issue of populism is not just a double-edged sword, but even if you come from a union, we think about things, when you think about class, we think about, we're part of the populace. We're not part of the elite. But in thinking through what has happened in the United States as well as the globe, the person who is now president of the United States took the mantle and the mantra of populism. And the question now is Trumpism a form of extreme right-wing populism like you see in the French neo-fascist Le Pen or the Alternative for Germany? Is that why there is the constant targeting of the other, mindful of the fact that in the United States of America, the other will become more dominant than what is the white male? Or is it faux populism? Or is it pseudo-populism, as Tim has said in a recent podcast? In light of all the efforts that Trump and the Republican Congress have just done to massively redistribute wealth away from the people who voted for them, what does this all mean? And how do institutions like ours, who have actually tried to be the connective tissue for working folks and have seen our work as populist in nature, how do we actually try to deal with this? And I don't care which of you answer this first, but this is the question that keeps me up at night in terms of what, how do we make sense of this?
Okay, so let me riff on the question for a minute, and let me try to answer it. So the first thing I want to emphasize is that I agree with you that there's some kind of international trend, but and that should give us pause, or at least if there are any good liberals out there who assume that everything which is globalized is going to be good. It's pretty clear at this moment that the far right is far more globalized than any rival political formation at the moment. Just to give you an example, which is kind of trivial, but which is from the work that I do, if you look at the flag that the separatists in southeastern Ukraine chose for their flag, it was the battle flag of the Confederacy of the United States of America, and that's globalization, right? I mean, that's the borrowing of memes from other cultures, and so it's not. I wouldn't say that like Le Pen and Orban and Putin and Trump are all the same thing, but there is a lot of communication going on, and in that way, it's global. Another general remark I want to make is about race. I mean, I'm not sure if this is good news or it's bad news. It's probably bad news. It's entirely possible to tribalize a democratic society even without the race. So in Poland, for example, you have two political parties that are not so different from the two that we have. They basically have a center-right party and a far-right party, just like us. And their society is tribalized along very similar lines, and they have the same kinds of statistics of people will not marry those from the other party, right? Parents are ashamed if you're dating someone from the other party, right? Which, by the way, in the U.S. is already more resonant, at least statistically, than it is with race. Democrats and Republicans don't want their kids marrying people from the other party. So you can tribalize even without the race. So no matter what the numbers are, there's going to be a problem. So I want to speak, and so that leads me to what I want to say about populism, because the way I think populism works in this country can't be understood without getting inside white people and without understanding that racism is basically, racism is directed against black people in this country, but racism is basically a trap that some white people set for other white people. It's a substitute for policy, and that's what I mean by this pseudo-populism. So it's very nice when Randy asks, like, is this a variety of pseudo-populism? Although, as if pseudo-populism were some kind of like term that you'll find in the Encyclopedia of Populism. It's just something that I said, but I mean something by it. And what I mean is, now speaking directly to Randy's question, is that there is a long and strong tradition of populism which has two parts. It has a rhetorical part, where you say the things that you're not supposed to say, but it also generally had a substantial part or a policy part where you make proposals about how you might redistribute wealth, for example, right? Now, what I mean by pseudo-populism is that what we have in the United States is only half of that. There's the rhetorical part, which says, yes, I'm going to say the things that are on your minds, right? Trump says, I am your voice, which is a Hitler quote, by the way. I am your voice, right? Ich bin eure Stimme in the original German. I'm your voice. I'm the one who speaks for you. I say the things that you want to say, but you were afraid to. I break the taboos, right? That's what people call populism. But in my view, it's not populism because it doesn't come with the other half of the proposition. Once you break the rhetorical rules, you're then supposed to break the rules of distribution, which it's not just that they're not doing that, it's that they're doing the opposite. So how does pseudo-populism work then? Because like a lot of Democrats are stumped by this, or a lot of nice, rational people who I like to think of as my friends are stumped by this. Well, how does it work that you take stuff away from people and they keep voting for you? Or worse, they vote for you because you're taking stuff away from them. How does that work? What's that dynamic? Okay, so to set this up, let's first think of how politics is supposed to work. The way that politics is supposed to work in a two-party democracy is that Party A has one set of policy proposals which speaks to the interest of these guys. Party B has a set of policy proposals that speaks to the interest of these guys. These people are somewhere in the middle. But both parties are proposing some version of the future in which there are different policies than we have now. Okay? So both parties are saying, hey, the future is going to be better than the present. They just have different ideas, and they're offering those ideas to different sets of people. That's not what's happening now. So that's a positive sum game, right? We're saying, hey, there's going to be more stuff, there's going to be more good stuff, there are going to be gains. That's not what's happening now. What's happening now is not gain, but pain. Literally pain, right? So who brought Trump to office? Where were the decisive places that brought him to office? Which counties did he take that Obama took in 2012? Which counties did he take where he took 20, 30 more points than Romney when Romney won those counties? Those are counties where people are committing suicide, right? People know this, right? Those are counties which are in public health crisis. Those aren't the only people who voted for Trump, but that was the difference. That's what pushed him over in Ohio. That's what pushed him over in Pennsylvania. Every single county that he won in Pennsylvania, that Obama won 4 years ago, is an opioid crisis. Every single one. Every single county in Ohio that he won, except for one, that he took from Obama, was an opioid crisis. And I just use that as a shorthand for public health crisis, misery, right? So there is real pain. And the last thing that people who are committing suicide and dying, deaths of misery need is for their health care to be taken away. That's literally the last thing they need. The last thing that they need is a new tax law, which is going to make social insurance much more difficult. Which the Republicans have openly said, we're going to use this now to create a deficit so we can do away with what remains of the welfare state. That's the last thing. So how can that possibly work? Here's the way that it works. It works like this. And just stay with me here. You're no longer talking about gain, right? I'm no longer saying there's more in the future. I'm saying there's less. It's going to be pain. And the benefit that you get by voting for me is that you get to feel like you're on the side of the people who are dealing out the pain. Think about Celebrity Apprentice. What's Celebrity Apprentice? An oligarch comes to you and he says you're fired. He gives you the pain. And what's the fun of watching Celebrity Apprentice or The Apprentice? You feel like you're on the side. You're with the guy who's dealing out the pain, right? This is how pseudo-populism works. You take the pain because you identify with the guy, and you think, I'm on the side of the people who are dealing out the pain. And then here's where the race part comes in. Because if you're white, you think, well, I'm self-sufficient, I don't need the government, which is, by the way, totally untrue of white people. By the way, because white people don't realize how much the government does for them. This is sort of our big problem, right? They don't realize how much the government does for them, and therefore when you take the government away from them, they're like, okay, now I commit suicide. I'm sad to say, but that's basically true, right? Look at the statistics for white males committing suicide, right? 20 American veterans commit suicide every day. 50 American farmers commit suicide every day. 50 every day. And those are the very same white people who talk about the independence and how they don't need the government, right? There's a big problem. So the way this works is you think, I'm willing to suffer, I'm independent, I'm that lonely pioneer, I can do it. But what you're also thinking is the people who are going to suffer more are the immigrants, right? The Muslims, and above all, the blacks. That's what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, I'm standing up straight as an American doing it on my own. I'm going to suffer a little bit, but those other people are going to suffer more. The way pseudo-populism works is that politics shifts from being a positive-sum game into a negative-sum game, where it's not about gain, it's about pain. It's not about distributing gain anymore. It's about distributing pain. And the way you can side with somebody like this is you think, well, I'm kind of with him. We are dishing out the pain to other people, right? So that's about as good as I can do, trying to explain what's going on. But we have to have an explanation which helps us to see how this is working, right? We can't just say to people, "Oh, your vote's irrational." That's not going to be enough. So there we go. That's pseudo-populism.
So that was incredibly rich and thought-provoking. I think I'm going to say something smaller, but I hope it is also helpful.
Well, you said something pretty big a few minutes ago, which we'll get back to.
Alrighty. I think I certainly have found the conversations about populism confusing, partly for the reasons that you suggested. That is, there are plenty of us who, in our civic work extremely hard to connect ordinary people and their needs and interests to governmental efficacy. And surely there are elements of populism in that. The way I've come to think about it has got more to do with a social contract concept. That is, I take it that populism names the phenomenon when the people, ordinary people, no longer want to have their political experience mediated through elites of one kind or another. Whether those are bureaucratic elites or media elites, they just want that all swept away. They want a direct contract, in effect, with the guy in charge and no more mediation. But I think the other half that goes with that, and I think part of what's caused the sort of kind of populism we're seeing, is the problem of technocracy. So technocracy is when people are setting policy really absent attention to and consideration of ordinary people. And I have to say, I think many of my economist colleagues have been guilty of this approach to policymaking. And let me just give you a very concrete example. In the last year, I've had conversations with economists who have said to me, yes, when we thought about globalization, we modeled a 20-year transition. We, expected the whole thing to work its way through in 20 years. And, that's that, neat and clean, 20 years, no problem, off you go. Now, it's one thing to model that in terms of macroeconomics and numbers and so forth. It's quite another thing. But what does 20 years of disruption mean in the lives of particular people and particular communities? And so the notion that you would set policy based purely on that economic, technocratic expertise and not marry it to the kind of expertise that ordinary people have about what are the real prospects for mobility? Like, how do I get another job? Do I really have to reskill at the age of 55? Like, is that really what you're talking about for me? And I think that was a failure on the part of our elites, in all honesty, with regard to the social contract. So I see the kind of populism that we're living through as a reaction to a failure of people in think tanks, people in universities, et cetera, to understand how to partner their expertise with the kind of knowledge that ordinary people have. So I think to your phrase that one of the things that AFT does is try to establish a connective tissue, that couldn't be more important. I think another word for that connective tissue is like the social contract, right? The ways in which people put different resources on the table partnering together to try to make the world better for ordinary people. That's how I've started thinking about this issue.
This actually Oh, I'm sorry. I constantly forget that red is on. Red is on. So this actually raises, because we are an educational institution, we need to spend a lot of time talking about, in some ways, what do we do about this? So I want to get to, the issues of kind of both democratic citizenship writ large and then the classroom as like the two last questions that I wanted to ask both of you. But before I do that, I just also think, as Danielle, you were talking, I think that there were, in the last probably decade, there's a lot of people that fell in love with market forces. And in some ways, as you were talking, I was thinking about, because market forces, like in a place where we were just in yesterday, McDowell County, West Virginia, where we lead a public-private partnership, market forces abandoned that community. Market forces have abandoned many of the communities that voted for Obama and then voted for Trump, and where people felt like, well, the government did not do what we believed was promised to, in some ways, disrupt those market forces. But this whole notion of the reason, and this gets into my next question, but the reason I asked the question about populism is that what we have actually witnessed, I think, with President Trump is the hijacking of words that meant something else to many of us. The rigged economy, populism. And what we've actually seen, or what I've actually tried to do, and I'm glad you raised the social contract, is to actually talk about the contrast in terms of Trump running as a populist but governing for the elite, and trying to actually think about that contrast in terms of the hypocrisy of it, and looking at, which is one of the reasons I raised, Tim's podcast about pseudo-populism, because we go back to even the book that I think Tom Franks wrote about What's the Matter with Kansas, which was attempting to, in some ways, answer that same question. And I do think, as progressives, I'll just say it for myself, I think that the union and other progressive institutions, we actually have to grapple with this because we have to grapple with the first comment you made, Danielle, which is how do we actually reconnect with the American people writ large, as opposed to saying that you were wrong, but trying to figure out how to deal with this as we're, how to deal with the economic issues and how to try to explain it, teach it, which is what makes education even that much more important. So on the two education questions, I want to think about education for adults first, and then education for kids. We often do it the other way, but again, it raises, it raises a question. Both what I love about both of these scholars is that they've actually been teaching adults, not just teaching students, in terms of what democracy and democratic citizenship mean in this period of time. So, I would argue if Leo and I were still teaching in school and teaching our juniors and seniors, we would talk about how democratic citizenship is essential to preserving and nurturing democracy. And we would talk about, frankly, in our classes, how voting was a sacred right, or is a sacred right and responsibility of every citizen, and the government's job is to promote the broadest possible involvement of citizenry in the elections. You notice I'm reading this because I have to stick to my notes here, and that would create that kind of confidence, something that I think Tim has already said, yes, that is the aspiration, and we would be teaching in high schools that aspiration. And there would be, even when I was teaching in the 1990s, there would still be a consensus about that aspiration. This was well before all of the voting suppression of this generation. What's interesting now is that the age of political polarization is now the lens through which everyone looks at everything. As a result, even when you start talking about wanting more people to vote, which is what we used to teach, that is now a political issue, not a democracy issue. As we see with the voter suppression panel, as we saw with all the gerrymandering. So you actually, Danielle, you've kind of written the book on this, on American citizenship after Brown, and you talk about the ability to talk to strangers, which is what you said at the beginning. And that really matters. So, how do you help us navigate through this age of polarization the importance of democratic citizenship?
So it's a really hard, deep question, and I think one of the challenges is the need to work on so many different levels at once. And so the one key question is how to achieve the division of labor that makes that possible. So at some level, I think in communities across the country, we do actually just need to be rebuilding cross-ideological alliances for, at the bare minimum, problem exploration. Like, forget about solution for the moment. Could we even imagine cross-ideological problem exploration conversations? And there are people who are working on this. There's a guy named Bill Doherty running a program called Better Angels, which actually started a few years before the election, but it's exploded since then. And it's, he's trained as a psychologist and family therapist, and they build projects that bring together people who are on opposite sides of a divide, not always partisan. So, for example, they have one program, I think in Minneapolis, that brings together police officers and black men who have a lot of exposure to the police. And it takes a lot to build up the trust that makes it possible to begin to actually do meaningful problem solving. But I think we do actually just need an expansion of efforts like that on the one hand. I know of another group of people in Ohio working on something called the Shared Values Initiative, which is an effort, again, to build workshops that bring together people from divergent positions around the basic concepts of liberty and justice for all. What does that actually connect to? When you look at the world around you and see things that are wrong with it, why do those things that are wrong register in terms of the idea of, or how do they register in terms of liberty and justice for all, with the justice for all idea being an equality idea alongside the liberty idea? That's kind of very rudimentary, right? Sort of beginning to rebuild there. Then I think the other thing that's incredibly important is converting technocracy into leadership. Actually, and that's sort of working with adults at a different spectrum. It's working with folks who have PhDs or are sitting in managerial positions and so forth, and breaking up the complacency of their own professionalization, exposing them to people whose knowledge bases are built up quite differently, and requiring them to take seriously the kinds of learning people get from working day after day in, a methadone clinic or something of the sort. That is a much deeper sort of practitioner, quote unquote, professional networks of collaboration than we've had for a while. Those are all very nitty gritty things. But the point I'm trying to make is I think that the sort of adult part of the education has to be about rebuilding, cross-class alliances, rebuilding a capacity to do problem solving, problem identification, across boundaries of difference and so forth. And then I think if we can get that going, say 5 years worth of activity spreading around the country of that kind, then you start to have more capacity to talk about things like voting again and so forth, and work on that collectively and not have that fall into a polarized partisan trap.
Wow. Thank you. You've also, I think about what you've written in terms of, kind of castigating alternative facts, and that kind of, I love that kind of, and exposing, some of the hypocrisies here. But how do you wrote this book to actually, just like Danielle talked about when she had a whole bunch of colleagues say to her, what do we do about this? In some ways, the question that you are answering, at least in my judgment, when you wrote this book, was to think about how to get people to do something. But how do you think about democratic citizenship in this age of political polarization where, we're just kind of our sense of the common good has been frayed?
Let me try to answer that by summarizing some things that I think we've said already, and then maybe saying one new thing. Let me start with an anecdote, which is Twitter and text to vote. So I'm not sure how many of you were caught up in Twitter telling you that you can text to vote. This was a Russian operation which was designed to prevent Americans from voting by using bots which sent out tweets to Americans saying, hey, you can text to vote, you don't have to go to the polls, right? And this was so pervasive that Twitter's idea about the world is that like the truth always rises to the top so long as there's enough exchange, which was like totally naive when Milton said it, and like already impossible to believe when John Stuart Mill said it, and just one of these like very silly liberal ideas. But Twitter's idea is that we're never going to comment on stuff that people say because the truth will always rise to the top. In this case, even Twitter had to intervene because there was so much of this text to vote, right? This was a foreign intervention in our electoral process, but let's put that to the side. What does it say about us? What does it say about us that when we hear, oh, I can text to vote, I would rather do that, right? I'd rather do that. Now, the cynics among you may be saying, well, I guess this is true of my district in New Haven too. I didn't want to wait for 3 hours in line, okay? But I'm trying to make a different point, which is that voting is one of the very few times we actually get our bodies out to do anything which involves the country, if we're typical. And it seems to me that a common thread in some of the questions and some of Danielle's answers has had to do with precisely that, like that you have to get your body out and do something. That these conversations about what we might have in common, recognizing problems, as Danielle said, even if we don't know solutions, that requires a face-to-face conversation. It just doesn't happen over the internet. You can get people out on the street with the internet, you can do cool stuff with the internet, but you can't have that kind of conversation. And I think the reason, and this is a very old-fashioned point, which goes back to some of the philosophical traditions that Danielle cites, the reason for that has to do with recognition. You have to see the other person and recognize them as a human being. And so one of the things which has happened to us, which has made all of this much more difficult, and it gets to the polarization and the question of what it means to be a citizen, is that it's just much easier to not recognize somebody as a human being if you're on the internet. It's just, and the average American spends 10 hours and 48 minutes in front of a screen every day. So what are we actually doing? Right? If you put those, if you take those 11 hours out and then like 5 hours for sleeping, and if you're me, 5 hours for getting your kids ready to school in the morning, like how much time do you have left in a day, right? For actual normal interaction with people. And I make this as a very serious point. Like the Twitter thing is just one little example. And this goes to the question about economics. I'm going to pick up Danielle's theme about economics. The last time we had a globalization, and this is what happens when you invite historians. Historians will say, well, this already happened once, and we learned the lessons, and then we forgot them. But with globalization, it's true. We had a globalization. It lasted from the 1870s into the 1930s. It blew up the first time. In the first globalization, people said exactly the same things that people say in this globalization, or said. They said growth is going to lead to enlightenment, fanaticism is going to go away, nationalism is a passing phase, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Chapter and verse, people said the same stuff in the 1890s, as I said, in the 1990s. And then we learned a lesson. Even the economists learned a lesson, right? The lesson the economists learned in the 1930s, and John Maynard Keynes was the most important in this, was that everybody has a lifespan. People get sick. People are shocked when there's a Great Depression. It's not just a matter of the numbers, it's a matter of the experiences. And so if you're going to be a good economist, you have to take into account that you're dealing with people. Right? People who are at some point on a specific life. And you have to then, political economy means setting up the economy so that shocks to the numbers don't have to be shocks to everybody. Right? We learned that once, and that's the sadness of where we are now, is that we've forgotten that human tradition in economics. And I mean, there's a fundamental point here which goes to education. And again, I'm trying to summarize some themes here. What the economists assume, and what the libertarians, who are very important in American political discussions, assume, is that there's this thing called an individual, and that individual makes rational decisions. Like that individual is just out there, right? You just start from the assumption that there is that individual. And I mean, anybody who's ever done any teaching or parenting or anything, or anybody who has ever been a child, knows that this is not true, right? You were not, when you were 4, you were not the individual of Economics 101. You were not making rational decisions about your priorities and so on. You were not spending your money rationally. I mean, my kid who's 7 has a wallet. I mean, he does not behave the way that you should behave according to Economics 101. It's going to take a lot of work, right?
You should see my 7-year-old. My 7-year-old will take your 7-year-old's money.
Yeah. That has already happened. He has that friend. And I'm like joking conservative. I'm like, yeah, you just learned your lesson. Yeah, money's important, you see. Anyway, where was I going with this? The point, but see, this is the paradox of American political conversation. The whole point of education, is to create those individuals. You have to create them. It takes a huge amount of collective investment, work, contact, money to create individuals in the first place. And where we've gotten ourselves to in our national conversation in the last 25 years is that we just assume those individuals are out there, and they're not. Creating them is the national task. If you want to have a nation, you have to invest in education to create the individuals. And that's what we've punted on, I think, in the last quarter century. And so for all those economists and all those libertarians whose emphasis on individualism, in some sense, I agree with. I think we should be trying to become individuals. It takes a hell of a lot of work. You can't just postulate it, right? You can't just postulate that Americans are individuals who think rationally about their interests. You got to make those people. You got to make them. You got to make them happen. Now, I'm going to say one thing about truth. And again, it gets to some of the philosophical traditions that show up in Danielle's work. We need truth a lot more than we think. Just lying at people, laughing when people get things wrong isn't enough, or even calling it hypocrisy is not enough. There's a generic boundary here between fiction and reality. And it's not that I'm, always right or that Mr. Trump is always wrong, but there is a difference. And the difference is that Mr. Trump lives in fiction, right? He doesn't actually lie. His reality is untruth. It's not possible for him to lie. It's not a lie. To him, it's not a lie, right? He lives in fiction. And so for us to say, oh, well, like, you got that wrong, or, that was a mistake, or that was fine, that doesn't actually make sense. He's functioning as a fictional character. And you're not supposed to laugh, damn it. The whole point is that's a different political system, where the leader creates a legend which isn't verifiable by the data, right? Where the leader uses the language to create a literary product. That's a different political system than the one that we're in. Which means that if you want to defend the one that you're in, where we're all supposed to be individuals, you have to create a little sort of bubble or cocoon of factuality around yourself, right? Like, that's your job, is to create this little shell of factuality around yourself, not just to react to what looks like the lunacy or the untruth, because it's not just that. It's an alternative proposition about how politics is supposed to work or to be. And so factuality is at the beginning of all of this. And of course, to get people, and again, this is contra the libertarians, for all these libertarians who I know, it took so much social investment to create each libertarian, right? And like, the way that you become a libertarian is you grow up and you forget it, right? You grow up and you say, oh yes, I was just like somebody put an axe into, Zeus's head and I popped out, fully formed libertarian. No, right? The entire British Empire was needed to create John Stuart Mill, right? You have to have so much social investment to create that one person who then tells you that individuals are automatic. So to get to the factuality, you need the factuality to be a citizen, right? Being a citizen means that you're thinking about things for yourself. You're creating this little protective bubble around yourself, maybe sharing it with others. But to get there, you need the education. It doesn't come naturally. Okay, I'll stop there.
To my last question, I said there were 4 questions, and there'll be time for other questions, and even questions that you two may have of me or others. But that gets us to there's a lot of K-12 and higher educators who are either in this room or listening on the live feed, or who will be listening to this or viewing this later. And the question that we constantly have for ourselves, that Leo and I and others in this room constantly ask is, okay, what do we do in our classrooms? What does this mean? How do we teach? I'm a social studies teacher. Jefferson would laud long ago that democratic citizenship is not a natural state of grace where one is born, but it is the habits of living that one must learn and practice. Many of us talk about, you have to walk in each other's shoes. You have to see each other as people. What do we do as American educators? How do we respond to the expressions of hate and prejudice and the kind of bullying that now shows up in our classrooms each and every day? And frankly, how in a period of time when STEM is so important or when testing is so important, how do we teach in a way that kind of engages kids to think that either democracy matters, citizenship matters, voting matters, or things like that? I'm sure that's too open-ended and it's unfair to ask you all of that at the same time. But since we have both of you here, that is the question that most of us are thinking about every single day.
Well, I first of all want to say, and hopefully there are some folks watching out there, that I think the people who are best at answering that question are teachers who understand the challenges and the points of influence with young people. So in that regard, I will offer some thoughts, but with humility, I think the answers have to be worked out in practice by teachers. But I would say a couple of things. The first is just that as I think about educating young people for civic agency, I think that they need both a set of capacities, skills, know-how, experiences of empowerment, and then they also need bodies of civic knowledge. And I think it can be helpful just to sort of outline those two things as separable things. And I think this can help a little bit get around the polarization question. So for example, for the capacities piece, they need to know how to identify community problems, right? How to articulate the problem, how to find people who also care about that problem, brainstorm solutions, and then they need the sort of basic know-how of, well, given this is the problem, what are the levers to pull to actually change it, right? So that's all the sort of the how, the why, you're motivated because you care about problems in your own community, and the how, the kinds of things that you can actually pull and change to achieve something. What I've left out in that account is the what, how you decide what kind of solution is the right kind of solution. That's where I would say different bodies of civic knowledge are relevant. And this is where we get into the polarization terrain, okay? Because you could have social justice civic knowledge that would give you one set of answers. You could have libertarian civic knowledge, would give you another set of answers. You could have what I call the sort of proceduralist civic knowledge, which is where you really believe in the democratic process as such, and sort of working through procedures is substantively the goal that you're after. Or you could have what I call sort of egalitarian participatory body of knowledge, civic knowledge, which is about the value to all of us as human beings of being change makers and building processes and experiences that support being a change maker. Okay, so like 4 different bodies of civic knowledge, they generate different kinds of policy solutions, right? So there's a part of me that wonders whether we could short circuit some of the polarization conversation if we were a little more explicit about those sort of 4 different bodies of civic knowledge, expose kids to all 4 as a part of helping them pick the line they want to explore and understand more deeply. Maybe they pick the social justice line, maybe they pick the libertarian line. But in the process, hopefully we're also giving them the capacities to build dialogues across disagreement, spaces of disagreement, right? So capacities and skills, bodies of civic knowledge, and it all needs in some ways to be put in practice, not just book learning, not just paper learning, not just one-to-one communication learning, but active learning.
Would you require debate or a project? Like if you were the head, if you were Betsy DeVos. Oh no, we should say that larger. There should have been a much bigger no. But if Betsy DeVos called you tomorrow and said, "What should I do, Danielle?" Would you, off of your last comment, would you say to her, because if she called me tomorrow and asked me, she would do the exact opposite of what I would say. But would you actually push her or prod her to do that kind of project-based learning you were just talking about, or even debate across high school classrooms?
So I would, but I'll say one other thing, which is I actually think in order for us to make progress on rebuilding civic education, we need to let that conversation really operate at the level of the states and accept plurality, accept a diversity of approaches. And that's why I said, I really think this is about teachers, teachers experimenting. And my kind of request to teachers would be that they experiment self-consciously around the capacities piece, the skills, the know-how piece, the empowering agency piece, and that they experiment self-consciously around the different bodies of civic knowledge. So in some sense, my request to Secretary DeVos would be, can we incentivize this kind of experimentation for our teachers, and let our teachers show us the pathway forward on this. On the issue of debate, though, I want to just say quickly, I do think debate and action projects are really important. And but with debate, I think it's actually really important that students have to pull a position out of the hat. That is, they don't start by debating the thing that they already think they believe, and that they test their ability to argue another position all the way through. I think that's a hugely important thing. But the last thing I would say is, I believe that there's this like secret dynamic opportunity in the Common Core, in the requirement that the Declaration of Independence be taught. That's everywhere, right? Like almost everywhere, whatever, 40-something states still, right? Am I right about that? All right.
Well, it's called something else.
Okay.
But it is actually in the vast majority of states, there is a requirement somewhere in some place in K-12 or in high school, and primarily in high school, to actually teach the Declaration and to also teach a little bit of the Constitution.
But the Declaration, man, you can hang a heck of a lot of stuff on the Declaration. All right, so let me just remind you, okay? It's a how-to manual, all right? That how-to manual goes, first you gotta figure out what your problem is, list of grievances, all right? And then you gotta figure out what your values are for having some solutions. You know, all people are created equal, and we build governments to affect our safety and happiness together, right? That's in there, right? And you have to put together your grievances and the things you care about in a rhetorically effective structure that will bring you allies like Spain and France, not to mention everybody else in the colonies. And you've got to be committed to some actions at the end of it. In that particular case, you know, putting on your battle gear, actually getting out there and fighting. But you've got the whole thing right there. You know, the values, the policy problems, the policy solutions, the narratives to build allies, the approach to building allies, and the commitment to action. Boom, right there, Declaration of Independence, all right? Start from the end, the little last bit where they say, we therefore resolve what they decide to do. Just have the kids read that and ask them to think about, how do you get to that point of resolving to do something, take an action, and what would you resolve to do? And then why? What are the problems? What are the values that motivate you? How do you build the community of solidarity around you to move this thing forward? Honestly, like you don't need anything other than that text to build a whole civic education curriculum.
Wow. Okay, Tim, you get the last word on the 4 questions.
Okay, so even more than Danielle, and much more than Danielle. In fact, I'm an amateur on what to do in the classroom. So I'm gonna take the question very broadly, and look at classrooms from a perspective that's familiar to me, which is historically. I think the condition that you're describing as exceptional, Randy, is actually normal. It's normal for teachers to be teaching in an authoritarian, racist environment, unfortunately. I mean, historically speaking, that's typical. It's typical in this country. It's typical also, at least in the countries that I work on. And that means that, and here's the other side of it, that there are lots of positive examples of teachers who in those conditions have made a huge difference. In fact, as you were asking the question, I was thinking about the sociology of resistance in Eastern Europe, which is the part of the world that I work on. And it's striking how often the people who turn out to be the resistors of a generation actually go back to a particular classroom and a particular teacher, not necessarily a university instructor, and not somebody who taught them to be revolutionaries, but usually somebody who taught them how to think and how to be together, and who gave them the kinds of habits that the two of you have been talking about, such that they were able to do other things together later in life. Actually, it's only a slight exaggeration to say that the leading resistors in Poland were people who knew each other literally from elementary school all the way through, right? And one could repeat that story across different generations. So this is just by way of saying that the teacher is always going to be an exceptional figure, an alternative source of authority. And sometimes you're dealt a hand where that's going to be harder, more full of friction than other times, but it's always going to be true. We're just in a historical moment where being a teacher or being a journalist counts for much more than it would at other times. So how to teach? I'm gonna say a bunch of things which I think are extremely conservative here, because I think in discussion of curriculum, I think we really do have room for a lot of common ground, and we have ways of getting across what I think is often a false polarization. I think a lot of the polarization takes place impersonally in this country, and I think a theme of this conversation is that some of it can be gotten over if we just find the right way to talk about it. And one way to talk about it, I think, is precisely the documents at the beginning of the history of this country. The Declaration also talks about what happens in the course of human events. To me, that's really important, like as a historian, really important. The course of human events, that things change. So this is why history is so important. And one of the things that's happened in the last 25 years is that we really have lost track of history. And I say this as somebody who spends a lot of time talking to Americans. For the last 15 years, I spent a lot of time in public talking to Americans about history. We really have let it go. And it's not just the things that we should know. It's more the process, because where we've gotten ourselves to is a mental state nationally where we think everything is just the way that it is, and it has to be this way. Until it changes, and then we have no idea how to react to it, right? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, think of November of 2016, right? Everything has to be fine. Oh, but wait, it's not. Oh, but nothing like this has ever happened before to anyone. So what could we possibly do, right? What percentage of the American population reacted like that? A lot, right? We said nothing new can happen, and then when something new happens, you say, nothing like this has ever happened to anyone before, right? That's the American national reaction. So, and that's history, right? History tells you that not everything is totally new, that shocks are normal, right? That in the course of human events, things change, and sometimes you have to react, as Danielle was saying. You have to think about how you're going to react. And I would go a tiny bit further down this conservative alley and say the Constitution. The thing that particularly bugs me about political conversations in this country is the use of the word leader, which I'm allergic to because the word for leader in Italian is duce and the word for leader in German is Führer. But I don't think that's actually an accident. I mean, a leader is someone who is not designated as part of the constitutional system. It's rare to find a respectable constitution which uses the word leader. And there's a reason for that. A leader is not someone who can be defined legally or institutionally, right? A leader is someone who by definition is in an exceptional situation where you have to follow and I have to lead, right? Like there's a fire and I know where the exit is. And that's a different version of politics, the state of exception where I have to lead because, the building's on fire, right? For those of you watching the internet, the building is not actually on fire. Everything is fine. The audience is here. They're laughing at my jokes. It's chill. But this, yeah. This is that's like the famous First Amendment exception, which I just blew. But my point is that Americans like to talk about leaders, good leader, bad leader, strong leader. There aren't any leaders in our Constitution, right? It's a very simple thing, but there's a president, or there aren't leaders. And if we got our kids to think about the vocabulary of the Constitution, then I think we'd set some constraints on how we talk about politics. It's not a small mistake. A lot of people vote the way they do because they really think that someone can be a leader and just transform the whole system right away. They have unrealistic expectations because of the words that we use. The word leader creates an unrealistic expectation. Another little really conservative point is about genre. Why should we study literature? Again, not because I need you to learn this novel or that novel or this poem or that poem, but because literature is a genre. It's a genre of fiction, right? Knowing what fiction is really important. If you don't know what fiction is, then you don't recognize it, right? And I mean this 100% seriously. A lot of what is happening in America right now, and not just America, is that fiction is encroaching into real life. A generic boundary has been crossed. It's not just an irony that an entertainer is president, right? It's that this fictional character has crossed the generic line from it wasn't literature, it was television, but has crossed the generic line into real life. And that he doesn't tell the truth is normal because he's not from a genre where you tell the truth, right? And so if one thinks of literature and life, right, one can notice these kinds of things like, oh, television is one thing and the presidency is another thing. right? And it's from literature that you learn that kind of distinction. Another super conservative point is about math. I think the conversation about inequality in this country is difficult for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that if I say $6 trillion to $21 trillion is now in hiding offshore, which it is, and that's the fundamental political problem, I think, in the world, there just aren't that many people who know how much money that is, right? The difference between $1 trillion and $1 billion and $1 million is lost on a lot of folks. And when we talk about taxes, it's just true that a lot of people in our country cannot imagine somebody making $100,000 or $200,000, or they don't know the difference between making $200,000 and, let's say, $10 million. A lot of what's going on in this country hangs on the difference between the top 1%, the top 0.1%, and the top 0.01%, where the action really has been in the last 25 years. But if people don't know percentages and arithmetic, you can't get your mind around that. So I think the math is really important in getting people out of the pseudo-populist situation into a policy situation, because if you don't get the math, you don't see how this is a collective problem, right? And you don't see how it can be dealt with policy instruments. So I mean, those are my super conservative points about curriculum, which may be fantastically out of touch with the way the world really works. But I'm just going to close on this one. The gadget should not be in the classroom, right? That's been a total disaster. I mean, I realize that in some places it's justified. Like, I was just in a Quaker school in Costa Rica where they use the chrome because the humidity destroys the paper and it's too expensive to have a Xerox machine. I get it. Sometimes it helps, but as a presumption, the gadgets have been a disaster. It's not. I mean, here's my test, right? What do the people who make the gadgets do in their own schools? And the answer is, in their own schools, they don't allow the gadgets, right? The people who make the gadgets send their kids to schools without gadgets. So I mean, and it's important for the reasons of corporeality, of physical conversation that we've been talking about. If you, sir, if you have your laptop between yourself and me, then we don't have these nice moments of eye contact where I can tell when you agree and you don't agree, I think. If you're staring at your laptop, we're not actually communicating. The science on this is actually overwhelming. I can cite you some fantastic stuff about how badly students do in exams. It turns out that even if you can see your phone, if you can see it, it knocks your test scores down. Yeah, it does. And the reason is that there's a neural reason for this, which is that your brain recognizes this as part of its memory capacity. So if you can see it but not use it, it takes your test scores down, right? So kids will do a letter grade better on tests if they leave their phones at home. Right, and that's true for kind of all of us all the time. All right, so I'm dwelling on this, but I'm trying to bring us back to a theme, which is that a lot of the Greeks thought democracy happens among physical people in real life, and they had a point. If we're in doubt, the presumption has to be to get into a situation where physical people are talking to other physical people, and I think that holds for the classroom too.
So I wanted to just follow up on one point for the sake, we've had a lot of strenuous agreement on this panel. We might as well have one strenuous disagreement. And so I would offer a quite different account of the concept of leaders and leadership. Though you'll notice I've said leaders, I didn't say a leader or the leader. And I would agree with you about the danger of thinking that there should be the leader or a leader. That is absolutely problematic. But in fact, democracies are distinguished by a greater need for leadership than other political forms. Why is that? Very basic. Democracies have more committees. They just do. There are many more leadership roles in democracies than any other political form. And people need to recognize that as a part of preparing young people for citizenship. We rule and we rule in turn. So to be a leader is also to be a follower and to expect, there's this sort of back and forth, to be a partner in effect. But actually thinking self-consciously about leadership and what it means to do it well, which requires a partnering concept, not an absolutist concept, seems to me fundamental if you're thinking about democratic education.
Yeah, I am just blown away by this. I was chuckling a little as both Danielle and Tim started talking about the gadgets, as I now have a rule in my meetings that my meetings will be gadget-free, to try to get people to actually look at each other and talk to each other and engage with each other as opposed to looking at their gadgets. But now I will invoke the two of you in this process. But I do, there's, we have a couple of minutes for questions, and I don't want to use my, I don't want to disrupt that. I just want to say, just again, how much, and I've written about 7 pages of notes here, just how rich this conversation has been. And I don't know if others in the audience feel that way, but you've given us such depth of thoughtfulness in not just responding to this, but in giving us, at least at the AFT, a sense of lots of approaches that we can now take in terms of how we navigate this. So, for example, one of the things I'm going to talk to our Ed Issues department about and the Shanker Institute is maybe we should actually have some kind of nationwide, and I don't think contest is the right word, but some kind of nationwide engagement on the Declaration of Independence. And use Share My Lesson and others as a way of engaging teachers from classrooms all throughout the country to do that and to have that kind of guided debates, and then bring maybe, some of the winners of the contest to our convention to actually make this important and do that. And I really thank you for that. And Tim, I really thank you for actually helping us be a union of readers again. And a union where, and I see some people around who, have knew Al, far longer than I did, how Al Shanker would often go to a meeting of members or leaders or activists with a book to read and to say, let's all kind of read it and think about it. And because both of you have said, let's actually kind of think about what this moment is in the course of history and what we need to do about it. And I am very, very, very grateful that was the kind of tenor and tone of our conversation. Let me just, I see 3 questions. We will circulate. Okay. The gentleman in the blue shirt, you're getting a mic right now. And what I would ask, since I just saw 4 or 5 hands up, just if we can just make sure our questions are quick.
Yes, thank you. Anthony Garrett from Internews. My question is for Professor Snyder. Thank you for the B-. I thought we were going to get a C+. It's a question about technology, and the question has to do with, we almost everybody in this room comes from the Stone Age. We didn't grow up with personal computers. We didn't grow up with the internet. We didn't grow up with cell phones. Now you have 7 billion of these on the planet. And a lot of my young, cool friends love your work, but they think you're a Luddite. That you advocate reading books, reading newspapers, and stay away from the tablets. Thank you.
Well, I can program. How many of your young friends can?
Too many.
Yeah. So let me try to take that seriously. I think it's very important to try to be a human being, and it's not easy. And I think we only have so much time on the planet, and we have to take care how we spend that time. And the internet can be put to good uses, but if you don't have your little super ego, which rises above the body in front of the screen and the screen, if you don't have that super ego, that point of decision, which is able to say, I'm not doing the thing I came here to do, I'm here for too long. If you don't have that point, then you've got a problem. You're losing your humanity. So it's not that I don't do this stuff, but I try to recognize what it's like. I mean, I also drink beer, right? I mean, but I one or two a day. I mean, I try to be aware of what's going on while I'm doing it. With the internet, my own personal test is am I using the internet in such a way which is going to lead me or other people to do something in the real world? And if the answer is yes, then I'm happy using the internet, right? So people often ask me about the irony of putting the 20 lessons on Facebook. It's not an irony. The 20 lessons are on Facebook to help people do things off Facebook, right? I mean, so if you're using the internet to get people to organize a march, if you're using the internet to prescribe political behavior, I think that's perfectly fine. If you're using it to organize a kid's birthday party, I think that's perfectly fine. It's when it gets into you, or I would even say under you, right? Because the neural science of this is that the internet is able to get down to the parts of your brain that you're not particularly aware of, right? Down cerebrum, hippocampus, right? It gets down into you, and you find yourself reacting to stimuli without having the time to think about what you're doing, and then time changes, and before you know it, a lot of time has gone by. This is just true, right? And the people who design this stuff do it on purpose. So what I notice is that the kids who are really on top of things, like for example, some of the kids, and some of them really are kids. I'm not using kid to mean like somebody who's 40. Some of the kids, for example, who are organizing protests in Russia are extremely critical of the internet, right? They're extremely savvy about it, but also extremely critical of it because they've seen what can be made of it. So no, I mean, I'm not a Luddite, right? I actually know something about science and about technology, which is what I actually read some of this literature, which is one of the reasons why I have a caution about it. But basically, my basic line is this whole business about democracy depends upon citizens, and citizens have to be individuals, and becoming an individual is not easy. It's just not easy, and part of it is being able to pull back. Part of being an individual is being able to pull back.
Okay, let me, the gentleman all the way at the end had his hand up first. And then I'm going to this side.
Hello. As a self-confessed Luddite, I'm very sympathetic to everything you just said, but I had two questions, and I'm going to keep them relatively...
Would you tell us your name?
My name's Dell. I'm here at AFT. So the first question is, based on your work in Eastern Europe, I want to help. I'm interested if you have anything that could help us understand the relation of conspiracy to this emergent form of populism, particularly in the way that we now have a president who uses, many old tropes that were used by Il Duce himself, but also in this new sort of like emergent pattern where he's dealing with the GOP professionally, and then he's speaking to other people now LaRoche, for instance. LaRoche is very interested in this. And the second question that I have is, since many of the tropes that Trump uses are also messianic, that when people are talking about him, they're talking about a revolutionary leader in the same context that, well extending the way that we traditionally think about leaders. And I thought this was answered actually in your last thing when you were talking about your conservative points, which I thought was very helpful. But on a practical sense, how do we confront the sort of messianic tendency emerging in American political ideology now? And I think that's directly related to leader and to the notion of leader within a democratic society. And I would just be interested also in hearing that again. Sorry if that's too obtuse.
So do you mind if we just answer one of the questions?
I'm fine, yeah.
Okay, great.
Preferably the first one then.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that was great. I mean, it's really important stuff. On messianism, I'm not gonna answer it. I'm just gonna say that I think Jesus needs a certain amount of public relations support at this point. Because I mean, the way that Jesus has fallen out, there was a Messiah for Christians, right? I mean, not everybody has to agree he was the Messiah, but for Christians, there was a Messiah. So let's have a little PR in favor of loving thy neighbor and distributing to the poor and other things that Jesus said, right? Let's at least put Jesus in the conversation, right? If we're going to talk about messiahs. On conspiracy, this is really important. This gets to the heart of something which is crucial to all of this. And it goes back to education and factuality and creating individuals. When you believe in nothing, what you really believe is conspiracy, right? When you get totally separated from the world of facts, when you become that super cynical, super cool hipster person who's like, wears fake leather and is doubtful about everything, what you really believe in then is conspiracy, right? The total cynic is perfectly naive. Because when you believe in nothing, what end up happening to you inevitably is that you're fooled by the person who reaches something inside you, right? That's what happens. The super cool, cynical people, and this happened first in Russia, and you see more of it now here, the people who say that everything is propaganda, everything is PR, it's all a lie. Those people then go for the conspiracies, right? And so this is one more reason to care about factuality, because factuality is like the underbrush which gets in your way as you're like running headlong, to jump off the waterfall of conspiracy. It's that stuff which kind of slows you down before you fall off the edge. And I mean, so that's the way it works intellectually. There's an institutional story here too, which is that the media, okay? The media for a lot of people is this distant thing. And this is a problem in the US, right? Not just political bias, the fact that people get their news, like if you're sitting in a Nebraska sports bar, which is something I confess that I have done a good deal of, and you watch CNN, you think like, what does this have to do with me, right? These people are not going to cover me until there's a tornado. When there's a tornado, they're going to cover me, but until there's a tornado, they're not going to cover me here in Nebraska or Oklahoma or whatever it might be. And this is a problem because that turns journalism into the media. When they're local reporters, you might not like them, you might think that they're nosy or whatever, but they're people. And that's not the media, right? That's journalism or your newspaper. When that goes away, which it did in 2009, I'm saying this because this is like so many things that happened first in Russia and then it happens here. When the local news goes away, then the whole business becomes the media, and then people are suspicious of the media, which opens them up to the conspiracy story and the fake news story because it's distant from them, because there isn't the human contact to it.
I know this has been said decade after decade after decade. Oh, Christina Sloat. But I just wanted to go back to the issue of character and critical thinking. It was mentioned that there are many racist schools and many authoritarian schools. And I was lucky to go to a public high school that was neither. And multiculturalism was emphasized. And I think,
tell us which school it is, since you are public school proud about it?
Sure. It was Springfield High School in Springfield, Delaware County, Pennsylvania. It was a great school. I had some wonderful American Studies teachers that drove home the importance of the Constitution, studying the Constitution, knowing what your rights are. We learned the value of human rights globally, worldwide. Now we're in an era that's one could say post-multiculturalism, post-globalization, and things are a little more complicated by monies traversing boundaries. We've got Bitcoin and blockchain now, and we have to think a little bit more about what those monies are funding. So I want to challenge some on the conspiracy theory there. Very a gentle challenge, but I think the way that it is affecting our public education at the moment. I also...
Tell us what your question is to either of them or me.
Just, I think as we're talking about the importance of democracy and encouraging democratic citizenship, are we thinking about that and how it is affecting our schools? It's probably not as directly as it's not direct, being that we're talking about public schools here. That's one question. And the other question is about the importance of STEM education, which was brought up. And maybe it's more of a statement. But I think that we really do have to make sure that even if numbers are low, we have to think about the importance of studying biotechnology, nanotechnology. These are disciplines that are and have been popular around the world for a while, and there is a lot of nanotech and biotech being produced and manufactured overseas, which is presenting a security issue to all of us right now. And if we fall any further behind, we are going to be buried economically. So
Okay.
are we thinking about that, Danielle?
Sure, thank you. So I should also give a shout out to my own public school, Claremont High School in Southern California, where I had Dr. Palmer as my American politics teacher, who was fantastic. So I just want to say thank you to, again, public schools and teachers.
Dr. Palmer!
So a couple of things. I think it's important to distinguish between conspiracy and complexity. All right, so our world is extremely complex, and so mastering it intellectually is very challenging. And we need to equip people to walk their way through mastering it and then filter who are the experts that can help them understand that so they don't fall into the trap of conspiracy thinking, right? That is to say, mastery of complexity is what we want, falling into conspiracy thinking is what we do not want, which means economics, et cetera, various elements of social science are important parts of a basic education. And the intellectual complexity that we face just is a new challenge that we have to figure out in some ways how to surmount. My comments about STEM education were by no means to suggest that we should not invest in STEM education. It was to suggest two things. One, that we need to reinvest in humanities and social sciences where we've retrenched. And secondly, that to the degree that we are investing in STEM education, we need to give some thought to how we teach STEM such that it isn't counterproductive from a democratic point of view. It seems to me there's no reason STEM education couldn't itself advance capacities for citizenship. So I think it's incumbent on us to rethink STEM education so that it is doing that work at the same time that it's helping us advance STEM expertise.
Tim, I'm going to ask Tim to also respond, and then I'm basically, since it's about 4 minutes to 2, I'm going to ask our two speakers if they want to just have a final comment, because I want to just make sure that we end by 2. So I know there were other questions. My apologies for not getting to them. Tim.
Okay, I want to agree with you that the flow of money beyond the control of sovereign states is a major, in my view, the major world political issue right now. I think it's very hard to understand domestic politics without reference to that. The real estate career of Mr. Trump, for example, is built on the possibility of offshore shell companies and anonymous real estate transactions. It's built on an alternative economy which is beyond the reach of the law. If it's not for that, we don't have this person, we don't have this president, we're not having this conversation. So, but does that mean that this is a mystical world which is impossible to understand? No, on the contrary, it's exactly the opposite. This is a story which we can only follow if we have super traditional, hardworking journalists who pay attention to the facts. So there are these projects like the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, which if we take the trouble to read them, or even like the summaries of them in The Guardian, we find out really interesting things about how the world actually works, right? So that our Commerce Secretary is directly financially involved with Vladimir Putin's family is not a conspiracy. It's a fact. But it's a fact that we know thanks to the careful work of fact-finding journalists, right? So my answer would be that, yeah, there are these big, important, powerful flows out there, but it's incumbent upon us to educate people in a way so that they can figure these things out. The really good journalism in the last few years is precisely around the offshore stuff and the oligarchy. And we need more of that. And one way to get more of it is to educate people so that they can do it.
Thank you. So we've heard a lot about a lot, but critical thinking, importance of education, engagement, putting your gadgets away, but these are themes that have come up over and over again. And I just want to turn to both of you to see if you have kind of last moment advice or final comments and reflections after this incredible 2 hours we've had together.
I'll just tell a little story coming out of the Boston Public Schools, which was about civic education for kindergartners. We often forget how early you can start. And the city had a competition which involved the kindergartners identifying problems, going through workshops, coming up with solutions, etc. And the winning child, this was maybe 2 years ago, and I shouldn't say it was a team, right? It was also about teamwork and leadership in team context. The leading team had a proposal that the city should build throughout all the parks in the city, should install lockers in all the public parks. Now, why? So that parents, when they took their kids to the park, would put their cell phone in the locker.
Love it. Tim.
So very briefly, I'm gonna just flow from Danielle's focus on the Declaration of Independence. This is the course of human events. This is what it's like. We happen to be in a moment where the consequences of our actions in education and elsewhere are exaggerated and profound. That happens. History goes on. History is like that. And I think one underlying theme of all of this is that education in becoming that civic individual or that citizen is being able to see where you are or when you are. And it just so happens that we are in a moment where the course of human events is flowing, right? We're in a moment where what we decide to do has multiplying effects down the generations. And seeing that is part of educating ourselves. I mean, I think there's a double-barreled character to this conversation. We're not going to be educating the next generation if we can't somehow get our own feet planted in the reality that we're in. Personally, I don't see this entirely as a negative thing. I think the end of history paradigm and the way we were drifting the last 25 years, the there is no alternative stuff, was fatal. It was bound to lead to something like this, and now it has. And so now we're aware that history didn't come to an end. We're aware that there are alternatives, and a lot of them are bad. So now we need to get our feet down and get some traction on things and do what we can do. That's not entirely bad. There's an upside to this. And the upside is becoming citizens ourselves.
Thank you. I can't, I hope all of you join me in thanking both, yes, good, please, Danielle Allen and Tim Snyder for an evocative and profound last 2 hours. And this is the end of teaching democratic citizenship when democracy is at risk, at least the end of our panel, the end of our session. Fire, but not the end of the discussion. Thanks very much.